Hello, everybody, and welcome to In Conversation. My name is James Campbell, and on today's episode, I'm joined by Andrew Schartmann, author of Intellects Analyzing NES Music, Harmony, Form, and the Art of Technological Constraint. Andrew, thanks for joining me. It's wonderful to have you on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let's start off with a simple question. Can I just ask where you're calling in from and where you're based?
So I'm calling in from Boston, Massachusetts. This is where I live and teach, and it's home base for most of my academic and creative work.
What are the sort of subjects that you mainly focus on in terms of your teaching?
So I teach at a conservatory, so it's highly classically focused. So I teach things like harmony and counterpoint and musical form. But I also serve as audio director at an extended reality video game lab at Yale University, where I craft sound environments for XR games. So I also have, one foot in the practical world of this subject too.
What do your colleagues at the conservatoire make of your side project?
They really like it, actually. Some of the techniques of video game composition intersect quite nicely with with techniques in modern composition. And so there's actually a fair bit of overlap that you might not initially consider. So they're interested.
And in terms of research, what are your kind of broad interests?
My research focuses on video game music, of course, especially music of retro consoles like the NES. But also classical music, so particularly the worlds of Beethoven and Shostakovich. I'm also deeply interested in how music is structured, so we call that musical form. So a lot of my work centers on that area of musical form and how it functions across different styles and genres.
And what came to you first? Was it music or gaming?
That's a really great question. I don't even know if I know myself, to be honest. I would probably say music. I think my earliest memories of music are listening to my dad playing records of Beethoven's Beethoven's symphonies. And then gaming came a little later. My parents were a little apprehensive about getting me and my siblings a gaming console, but they got my brother an NES, and I was a little young for the NES at the time. So then eventually it was my turn, and I got an SNES.
So this project was probably a little bit nostalgic for you.
Yeah, nostalgia is certainly one of the drivers, though I came to realize very early on that this music, nostalgic as it is also deeply interesting.
I mean, I love this book, and I'm not a huge gamer, but I do remember the NES, and of course it was like my parents were also, they were a bit skeptical of whether I should have one of these things. So I didn't actually, but my cousins and a load of friends did. So having engaged with this book and been reading bits of it recently, I've been feeling a certain sense of nostalgia, most definitely, a lot of memories flooding back. But yeah, let me ask you a little bit about the genesis of the project. Let's jump in. So what inspired you to undertake such an in-depth study of like the NES music and the NES platform? And then also, can you just let us know a little bit about maybe how your background in music theory and audio direction kind of shaped your approach?
Sure. Well, I think like a lot of people who grew up in the 80s and 90s, there's definitely a nostalgia factor behind my interest in this music. But as I said a couple minutes ago, for me, it also goes a lot deeper. I think in academic circles, like especially in video game music scholarship, it's really focused on interactivity, and understandably so, because interactivity is one of the defining features that sets game music apart from other media, like, say, film music. But I think that focus has sometimes led scholars to dismiss the early game music as sort of primitive or unworthy of serious study because the technology, wasn't quite sophisticated enough to do the stuff they really wanted to do. You often hear that argument. So what I'm trying to show in the book is that NES music is incredibly inventive, but we have to meet it on its own terms. So when you shift the lens to think about creativity within constraint, it opens up a whole new appreciation for what these composers were doing. And the technical limitations, they were real and in some cases brutal, but I think that just makes the solutions they came up with even more impressive. So I'm especially interested in that intersection of composition and engineering, where artistry meets problem solving. I've actually been working on another project on the Atari, and problem solving is like a huge part of that because of the severely constrained tuning system. The other part of your question was about music theory and sound design and how does that shape my work. I guess I'd say two things. First, it gave me the skills to really understand the technological limitations and how they shaped musical choices. Like living in that world, I think is really important because there are certain things you might not consider if you're just approaching it exclusively academically. And then in terms of music theory, I guess it gave me the tools to formalize those observations into a kind of analytical system, something that other people could use if they wanted to study this repertoire in more depth.
That's fascinating. I was really interested by what you'd say about the technological constraints, because we've recently published some articles on the same thing, but within hip hop music, and how the sort of the grimy sound of 90s New York hip hop comes out of technological limitations and people stretching samples, and just fascinating to hear how that affected the composition. Were there any kind of like stories or gems or anything around technological constraints within the NES platform that kind of surprised you? Did you learn much from doing the research, like in terms of how people were, sort of forced to do certain things to create certain sounds because of the technological constraints?
I think this is maybe a little bit of a meta response, but I think one thing that surprised me, and this goes for early game music in general, is that unlike today, where we have designated sound engineers and composers for video games, in those early days, there was no such thing as a video game composer. So a lot of the people doing music for these games, with some exceptions, and in particular in the NES era, we have more exceptions where there are dedicated composers. But these are just like programmers who are doing their best to, write a catchy tune or something. We get a lot of borrowing from popular music in early game music because of that, and also borrowings from classical repertoire because we didn't have composers. And so people were just like, oh, there's a tune by, I don't know, Mozart, let's throw it in the game and figure out how to code it. So I think the technological constraints are interesting, but it's also just the constraints on the concept of what a video game composition could be and should be within the constraints of the economics of the business of the time. So that would be like one of the surprising things.
I just was wondering about this notion of harmony and form in 8-bit music, and how did the NES composers adapt traditional concepts of harmony and musical form to fit within the system's limitations? Kind of like moving on from that comment you just sort of said.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one thing that's important to understand as a precursor to answering that is that there wasn't really a model for what video game music should be at that time. It's easy today to think, oh, like that sounds like a video game track, or like if I'm going to write something for a video game score, it's like, oh, well, I have this set of options, But NES composers drew from all kinds of sources. It's a very eclectic repertoire. But I think popular music in general, because of its repetitive structures, tended to work especially well. Now, one of the constraints they were dealing with were constraints on memory. So they had so little space and they had to cram all of this music into that space. So repetition became a necessity. But unlike pop songs, I think what's particular to NES music is because of those constraints on memory, how those composers took repetition even further. And it was due to memory constraints, of course, but I think it's also important to recognize that within those constraints, they were also able to make deliberate aesthetic choices. So it's not just like, oh, we have to repeat, therefore everything is going to be like chock full of repetition. You can also repeat in many different kinds of ways. And that was another interesting revelation in studying this music. Harmonically, I think they often favored transpositions that were easy to code. So another constraint that is less talked about is just time. Humans have a limited amount of time to work on a project. Time is money, that kind of thing. So anything that's easier to code is a win. So just like shifting entire chords up by the same interval, think like power chords on a guitar. So that leads to some interesting harmonic results. for example, if you take a D major chord, it's easiest to transpose every single note in that chord up or down by the exact same interval. But the fallout of doing so, because the traditional major and minor scales are asymmetrical, is that you don't actually get the second chord within the same scale. So you end up getting kind of a modal flair to the music. So if I take D major and go up to E major, all of a sudden it has a Lydian flair to it instead of a traditional major or minor flair. But those decisions, you know, they weren't always theoretical. I think it's that they were just often very practical, but they did shape the sound of that music in lasting ways.
I was interested by this notion of variety as well, or the illusion of variety that you kind of discussed. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on how composers kind of create this illusion of variety despite like very repetitive loops. What kind of strategies would they have employed to achieve these effects?
You know, many years ago, I was working on a book on the original Super Mario Brothers soundtrack. And I had a conversation with an NES composer named Neil Baldwin. And he really drove home this idea that NES composers were illusionists. It's kind of where I got the idea. That their job was really to make the listener feel like more was happening than there actually was in the sound. And that wasn't just about like a limited number of sound channels. It was also about memory, as I alluded to previously. Like you could only store such a small amount of music that you had to reuse material constantly. So one strategy was to break music into small modular units, kind of like little Lego bricks. So say you write 4 musical bricks that are short and self-contained, but they're also flexible enough so that they can work in different orders and you can recombine them. Well, then suddenly you get quite a bit of variety from very little data. And so this is one of the main strategies composers would use. It's what I call modular composition in the book. The whole goal here, I think, at least if I'm understanding Neil correctly, was basically to delay or soften the listener's awareness of the loop, the macro loop. So at some point, everything has to repeat. It's just the nature of the business at that time. So you knew it was going to repeat eventually, but the best composers of that time sort of made you forget it was happening.
You do discuss this notion of modular and layered composition in chapters 4 and 5 from memory, and it does seem to be quite an important part of the book. But to delve a little bit deeper into the book and its structure, I really like the way that you've organized it into these 2 kind of key sections where you have kind of techniques, and then you have the actual analysis, which I think is wonderful. So you kind of provide, you know, this quite detailed explanation. And I would also like to say, because we're talking about quite complicated musical issues here, but in actuality you've written this in a very accessible way, and I think people can probably tell from the way that you're communicating verbally as well that like you're able to communicate you don't need to be a composer or a musician to comprehend what's going on here, and I think you've been really successful in breaking that down, and I think part of that success is down to the structure. So could you just tell us a little bit about how you chose to split the book into these 2 key sections, and maybe you could just also tell us a little bit about just let us know some of the techniques we haven't mentioned that you highlight, and then perhaps we could talk a little bit about some of the games that you analyze as well.
Sure. So the book is really in, you know, two main parts. The first part is really the theory building, and then the second part is an analysis of 5 games that I selected from the NES repertoire, sort of employing the tools that I develop in the first part. I also have an introduction, and I know like for some books, the introduction is kind of a throwaway and people start in chapter 1, but it's really important in this book because the historical context is so important to understanding NES music. It's a very interdisciplinary project, not just in the academic sense, but on the ground at the time, it was also very interdisciplinary because you were thinking about economics, you were thinking about computer coding, you were thinking about hardware limitations, you were thinking about musical issues, you were thinking about gameplay, and you know, there's a lot that goes into this. So that introduction sort of sets the scene of what that context was. And then the first part, you know, it develops a theory of harmony for this music. One of the things I mentioned earlier in this talk is that there was no model for what NES music should sound like. And so it's very eclectic. So you can't just take, say, classical theory or a theory of harmony for pop music and apply it to NES music. There are little variations and idiosyncrasies of the style that have to be reflected in the theory. So I build a theory of harmony, and then based on that, the crux of the book is really about a compositional problem that all of these composers faced, which is, how do you write music that repeats endlessly and excessively without driving someone nuts? And, perhaps more pointedly, without drawing attention to the fact that it's repeating. So this is the illusion of variety element that Neil Baldwin was getting at. And so I go through some of the main techniques that these composers used, and I go through it in sort of in two axes of music. I look at what I call the horizontal axis. So this is music unfolding in time, and that's the modular component, sort of the reordering of these little blocks in many different ways to squeeze more out of the lemon, so to speak. And then the other component is the vertical dimension. Because the NES has 5 channels, you can also do this modular technique only in, say, a single channel. So maybe you have 2 of the channels, having this wonderful complex duet, but then a 3rd channel is just repeating the same melodic fragment over and over and over again, and it just kind of works with the duet. So you're saving memory in one channel by using a modular technique, but the other channels are sort of free to do what they want. And this is what I call a layered compositional approach. So we have modular and layered. And that's really the gist of what I cover in the theoretical part. So it's harmony and form. And then in the last part of the book, the last half, I go through 5 major titles, or at least titles that I thought were meaningful within the NES repertoire.
Could you just sort of let us know what games they were that you focused on for those 5 analyses?
Sure. So just full disclosure, there are many other wonderful games for the NES that could have been included, but I'll give you a brief reasoning as to why I chose each of these 5. So I chose Super Mario Bros. Because not only was this a watershed game from a design standpoint, but also from the standpoint of musical creativity. Koji Kondo, the composer of that score, he didn't just ask what game music could sound like, he asked what it could do for the gaming experience. And that sounds, again, like an obvious thing from a 2025 standpoint, but in 1984, when they're developing Mario, that's not an obvious thing. He wanted the music to reflect how the player would feel rhythmically and emotionally while playing. And so in a sense, he's trying to anticipate that in the score and then write a score that makes you feel that way even more. So there's a deeper connection between the concept of the music and the gameplay experience. So that's why I chose Mario. Metroid is another game that I chose. And the main reason I chose this one is because it blurs the line between music and sound effects. So it plays with ambiguity, saying that, it's a spectrum. It's not that we have music and then we have sound effects and we treat them separately. You can have sound effects that sound like music, or you can't tell whether they're part of the underlying score. And that was wonderful for Metroid because the whole idea is to get the sound of this alien planet. And what a way to do that, by saying, well, we have sound effects and music, but we're kind of blurring the boundary. And so all of a sudden it has this almost, natural feel to it. It's like these are the sounds of the planet, but it's also music, but it's also sound effects. So this paves the way for some important techniques in gaming. I think of Silent Hill all the time, that wonderful horror game where you can't really tell, like, where's the sound coming from? Is it coming from my own house? Is there someone behind me? Is it in the game? And that's partly because of the blurring of different, things that are traditionally considered as binary distinctions. Dragon Warrior is a third one. I chose this really because it established some of the foundational norms of the RPG genre. And when we think of great video game music, naturally many RPGs come to mind. But I think what's especially interesting here is that the composer, Koichi Sugiyama, he used music to create a sense of regional identity, which is obviously a staple of RPGs today. And his thematic material becomes this kind of musical glue across the entire series. So there's a sense of reinforcing nostalgia, and there's a sense of world building, which again is something we take for granted now in franchises. But it was something relatively new at the time. Another thing that's really, I think, quirky and interesting about him is that he was a composer of, film and TV as well, like a very serious composer. And he thought of NES, even his NES scores, in an orchestral way, which was kind of a unique way to think of it. He wasn't thinking of it in terms of the NES sound chip. He was thinking of it in terms of an orchestra. I won't go into too much detail of the other two, but basically Mega Man 2, just because it's one of my favorite games and it's an amazing score. And then Silver Surfer, because I had to find a way to highlight Tim Follin. What an extraordinary composer of the NES era. We talked about making people believe there's more going on than there really is. Just listen to Silver Surfer. You will not believe it's coming from an NES, and you will not believe there are only 5 sound channels at play.
Oh, well, thank you for going into that. I think it's really worth just taking pause and showcasing why you chose some of those. I also can imagine there's plenty of our viewers right now who have one of those tunes cranking through their brains, which speaks to your earlier point about how catchy these things are without being unduly repetitive or making you want to go insane. I can imagine plenty of people have picked one of those and they're playing them out in their mind right now. But it sounds like there's probably quite a lot of legacy and influence that we can discuss here as well. So I did want to ask you, sort of, in what ways has NES music influenced contemporary video game scores? I think you started to allude to some of that. But yeah, what's some of how are some of those techniques, or how are some of the great successes perhaps had a continued legacy and influence, and maybe influenced some contemporary video game scores and the broader field of music composition?
I think one of the lasting influences of NES music, in my opinion, is the way it handles repetition. Composers, as we've talked about, had very little memory to work with, but they still had to create music that players could listen to for hours on end without becoming bored or fatigued. And that balance, I guess, between repetition and novelty is something that game composers still grapple with today. We always talk about all the technological advances in video games, and those are wonderful and true, but there's still the hard, cold reality that people are going to play games for hundreds of hours, and you have to be able to compose a score that lasts for hundreds of hours. And so repetition is just a natural part of it. So even though memory isn't so much an issue anymore, the core problem hasn't really gone away. So I guess you still need to be clever about the way you structure loops, the way you reuse material, the way you keep things engaging over time. And the NES has a lot to say about that. Another thing I'd say, even though there's a whole world of generative music now that tackles that problem in more dynamic ways, games like, Spore, No Man's Sky, all explore that territory. But even in more traditionally scored games, like Celeste or Undertale or, Shovel Knight, which is one of my favorites, you still hear that NES-inspired balance between familiarity and freshness. So people are literally still using those techniques. Indeed, some of the same composers of the NES era are writing music for some of these games.
Oh, great.
I think there's one other piece to this that I would mention, which is that this is like a little bit esoteric, I have to admit. I guess beyond all of that, there's something almost ineffable about the sound of video game music. There's certain norms and gestures of just what a game feels like. Like, oh, that's game sound. And a lot of that vocabulary was forged during the NES era. We sort of take it for granted for now. That's sort of becoming a theme of this talk. But those sonic expectations were built track by track, loop by loop, by the composers working within those early limitations.
Fascinating. Thank you very much for sharing that take. I know it was a bit of a difficult question, but I really appreciate that. And that's a really well put answer. So the book is obviously very interdisciplinary, but I wanted to ask you a little bit about audience and who's this really aimed for? Because it is very accessible. And I think people can tell that's quite clearly from your ability to communicate verbally here about quite complicated situations. That's very clear too. But yeah, who's this aimed at?
Well, the initial and primary audience for the book really was an academic one. It's written for an audience that wants to understand how NES music ticks, how it is built from the inside out, how it's structured, how the harmony works, all of those inner workings. But as I started, to get more deeply into the writing process, I already knew this going in, but it became more and more transparent to me just how interdisciplinary this whole subject area of NES music is. And so the audience suddenly broadened from this very narrow academic audience to like, wow, I can probably explain this in a way that is accessible to people who haven't studied music. And then they'll find their own niches of interest within this, whether it be in technology, aspects of cultural context or game studies, aspects of programming and that technological side. So you'd have to have some interest in one of those areas, I think, but it's a much broader audience than I had initially envisioned.
Yeah, I think you're definitely going to encourage quite a lot of interesting people to be involved in this book. It's been my experience from showcasing it at conferences and events as well, is that we're surprised who picks it up. And a lot of people, I think, for the nostalgic reasons, but then of course a lot of people because of other bits and pieces too. So I think now I'd like to move on to a few different topics and maybe a few quick time questions. Ask you a little bit about some of your own experiences. So if you don't mind, let's jump into a few of those quick time questions. So I wanted to ask you, you've kind of alluded to a few already, but what's your kind of top 3 favorite computer, video, arcade games to play?
Yeah, this is a terrible question because there are so many. I guess, some of this is just nostalgia based, but I'm thinking in particular about some of the games that were both really important to me growing up, but also almost transformative experientially. So Mega Man 2, Earthbound, and Breath of the Wild is the most recent. I had like some kind of outer body experience almost with that game.
Well, I mean, you came to your answer pretty quick, and I think it's just great there that people can go and check those games out if they're not familiar with them. Now, I did want to ask, what's your kind of top 3 favorite soundtracks developed for the NES specifically? Are there any that maybe you haven't mentioned already that you maybe didn't analyze that you really enjoyed too?
Totally. I mean, if we're talking about what I think are my favorites, Mega Man 2 just has to be there for many reasons. It's an outstanding score, but also has a special place in my heart. But I think Final Fantasy and DuckTales, I think, are just outstanding soundtracks that people should check out.
And of course, we've got a book on Final Fantasy looking at the soundtrack as well within the same series, which is actually another question I wanted to ask you is this is part of the Game Sound and Music series, and there's a few interesting books in there. One, in fact, dealing with nostalgia, others looking at Zelda and various other games. Could you just give us a little bit of information about the series and what's the kind of overarching themes of the series, and why did you end up, this book ended up in that series, I suppose I should say? Yeah.
Well, the book is part of the Studies in Game Sound and Music series from Intellect. And the series focuses on, I think, detailed but accessible analysis of game audio or gaming contexts. And this is a great fit because it treats NES music with the kind of depth and rigor that's often reserved for more modern scores. The series also makes a point, I think, of encouraging interdisciplinary work, drawing in not just musicologists, but also scholars and practitioners from media studies, technology, sound design, beyond, other disciplines. And my book really does sit right at the intersection of a lot of those different disciplines. So I think it combines, close musical analysis with historical research, technical hardware discussion, and insights from my own work in sound design as well.
And I also wanted to just congratulate you and, of course, the design team on the cover, which is fantastic. And I think it really does what it says on the tin. But you certainly will be getting some interested people picking that up at various conference tables or in bookshops. That's for sure. Well, back to our QuickTime questions, though. What would you say are the maybe three of the most influential soundtracks, not just for NES, but just kind of across any genre, any game from any period? Because I'm thinking of things like Quake always comes to mind for me, with like that kind of Trent Reznor, Nine Inch Nails collaboration. But are there any for you that kind of really sort of jump out that perhaps haven't been mentioned yet as well?
Well, that haven't been mentioned. I mean, I keep coming back to Super Mario Brothers, and I'm sorry, I know it's been mentioned, but yeah, it's just such a landmark soundtrack that I think it has to be there. I also, for the more like, I know this is recent, and I mentioned it already, but the Breath of the Wild soundtrack, it's a very special soundtrack. We talked about that blurring of the line between sound effect and music and ambient. I mean, it's just a sound environment. I don't know what else to call it, but it is done so sparsely and so beautifully. That's part of what gives that game its, it's almost like, religious isn't the right word. I can't think of the right word right now, but there's a pretty deeply emotional experience one can have with that game. And I think a lot of it has to do with the sound design. So that's another one that I think is very special. For a third one, I don't know. I mean, again, it's just so hard to pick. I think Shadows of the Colossus actually is another one that I think is, for a similar reason to Zelda, but this is ironic. I think the reason that's such a great score is because of its use of silence. And I think when we think of video game music and sound, we think of sound and music, evidently. Yeah. But the use of silence is so extraordinarily powerful in that game that it opens up another dimension of sound design for those who, want to look that way and take it and run with it.
Well, thank you very much for sharing those questions. I know there's a bit of overlap there, but just really kind of good to get your take on some of these classics. And I think people who might not be aware of all of them will be able to go and dip in there and take a look for themselves as well. Now, let's go on to a couple of questions a bit more about yourself and your writing. I was wondering if there have been any great influences on your own writing and your own research.
Yeah, I mean, one major influence is a music theorist still active today named William Kaplan. His writing is just incredibly clear and precise, and he really has a gift for explaining the most complex ideas, I think, in simple and accessible terms, and that's something I strive for in my own writing. For similar reasons, I also really love Oliver Sacks and Carl Sagan, and I really admire their ability to sort of bridge the ivory tower with, the general public in a way that doesn't dumb things down.
Have you been reading anything non-research related? Are there any books you've been reading recently that you would share with our audience?
Oh man, that's a great question. I'm starting a research fellowship at the Strong Museum of Play in Rochester, so I've been really diving deeply into to books about the Atari. So I'm sorry, it's still very academically related. But there's a book called Racing the Beam that's part of the MIT Press series called Platform Studies. And I think if you're interested in NES music and just the technological constraints therein, this is an even more constrained environment. And it's just amazing to me in reading this book what they're not even composers, what these programmers had to deal with. So if this is like your wheelhouse, the technological constraint aspect, early video games, that book called Racing the Beam is just really well done.
And I wanted to ask you, if you were hosting a dinner party and you're allowed to invite 5 guests, they can be dead or alive, anywhere from history, who would you invite?
Well, number one on my list would definitely be Ludwig van Beethoven. He's always been my favorite composer. I studied his music a lot, but he's also someone who I think left more questions than he left answers, and that'd be a great opportunity to ask. Alan Turing is another, is one of the fathers of computing. I would love to hear his thoughts on artificial intelligence and how it's reshaping the world in a world I don't know. He probably couldn't imagine.
Yeah.
Jane Goodall would also be on that list for her wisdom, her role as a steward of the natural world. I'd really want to hear her thoughts on the future of humanity through the lens of our relationship with the planet and this existential crisis we're facing. Isaac Newton, simply just because I want, there are other stand-ins that could replace him, but someone of that level of intellect, I think, would be fascinating to talk about just about anything with. And then there's my own grandmother on my dad's side. She escaped East Germany during the Second World War. She traveled the world and she lived just this extraordinary life, but I was too young to ask her about all these things before she passed away. So I'd love to have that opportunity.
It sounds like she's maybe been a bit of an influence on your own life, even if you weren't able to ask her all those questions.
Yeah, certainly in the eclectic interests, I think she was very much that way.
And I guess hopefully we can ask Isaac Newton for his best hummus recipe or something like that. It'd be great to get his culinary choices.
Exactly.
Well, on that note, Andrew, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast, and I really appreciate your insightful answers. I think you've done a fantastic job of explaining these techniques, and I think the book does the same thing. You certainly don't have to be a musicologist or a gamer, or it's very interdisciplinary and a great read. So I do urge everyone to take a look. So Analyzing NES Music, Harmony, Form, and the Art of Technological Constraint. Check that out at www.intellectbooks.com. And again, Andrew, thank you so much for your time. It's been wonderful having you as a guest on the show today.
Great. Thank you for having me.
And to the audience, we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.